All right, well, this topic tonight is pretty interesting how it fell because, as y'all mentioned earlier, it's my wife's anniversary, and one thing that I love doing in ministry is doing premarital counseling. I don't do marital counseling. I don't think I'm qualified for that. I do a lot of premarital counseling, and I absolutely despise weddings. I hate them with a passion, but premarital counseling is a lot of fun because you get to take a young man and a young woman who love each other and show them what a godly relationship looks like in Scripture. The interesting thing about that, and one thing we want to try to do with our class, is try to take what Scripture says in their world and transfer that into our world. And sometimes the bridge between those is pretty long and pretty broad, right? Well, that's what we're going to find with the Roman family. In Ephesians chapter 5, which we'll be looking at a little bit later, hopefully, but in Ephesians chapter 5, if you take that, what Paul says to husbands and wives, it really is groundbreaking and earth-shattering news. Because the world did not view husbands and wives, and later on in, I think it's chapter 6, verse 1, where Paul will talk about children and the slave relationship and all of that, which usually for us, we separate slavery and family because our world in America has separated slavery and the family, even in our own modern context of slavery in America. As we'll see tonight, the ancient world did not do that. Slaves were considered part of the household, and we'll look at why and how that is. So let's begin by talking about the definition of the family. Now, the term familia is the Latin term for family. I have a problem with calling the Greco-Roman family a family. And the reason I have that problem is because of how we think of a family. We think of a family based on blood relatives or marriage relatives, right? So my wife and I are a family. And when you marry into a family, you marry the other person's family, do you not? It's exactly what happens. And we see that in Scripture, I think, with in-laws and whatnot. In the Greco-Roman world, that's not necessarily the case. So notice the first point here. The familia consisted of a man, his sons, his daughters, and all physical property, including slaves. What's missing in that list? A wife. Well, how do you have a family without a wife? Now, the man will have a family and he will be married, but his wife always belongs to her father's familia. And so in today's world, we talk about giving away the bride, right? I tell my father-in-law all the time, we have kind of this running joke/jab, because one day, I'll never forget it, after church, he stopped me in the foyer. They go to church at Salem Creek, and he stopped me in the foyer, and he hugged my wife, and he said, "She may be your wife, but she's my daughter first." And I said, "No, that's not the biblical model of marriage. You gave her to me. If I give you a truck, it ain't your truck. It ain't my truck no more. You know, it's yours because I gave it to you. You gave her to me. She is my possession." 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and I am her possession. We are not our own, and we are no longer yours. Okay, so and it's humorous that we did that, and I understand. I love my father-in-law, and we joke and jab like that all the time. But the ancient world wouldn't have viewed it that way. You were forever the property of your father as a woman. Now, women were able to be citizens in the Roman world. They were able to have certain rights, and we'll talk about women in just a little bit. But it's interesting that you don't have the wife there because she does always belong to her father's familia. Another reason why I don't like using the term family is because of the slave issue. So slaves in the ancient world, and we'll talk about slavery, Lord willing, tonight, but slaves in the ancient world, of course, we all know vastly different than what we may think of when we talk about slaves for a number of reasons. There are a lot of similarities, however. When Onesimus runs away from the household of Philemon and meets up with Paul, Paul says well, I tell you what, why don't we just look at the passage, because sure enough, as I tell you, I'm going to misquote. Let me see if I can find the verse, along around verse 10 and 11. maybe a little bit longer. Okay, let me start reading in verse 10. I'm appealing to you concerning my child whose spiritual, there it is, verse 10, whose spiritual father I became during my imprisonment, that is, Onesimus. All right, whose spiritual father I became. Now, just about any commentary will tell you that Onesimus ran away from Philemon for whatever reason. We're not told in the text. There are a lot of people who believe that he stole something from Philemon or whatever. It's not told to us, so we don't really know. But most commentaries will tell you that Philemon, when he ran away, met up with Paul somehow, and that he became a Christian while he was with Paul. Now, here's my issue with that. I'm not saying that it didn't happen, but here's my issue. If Onesimus is a slave, and that theory is even, weak as it is, if he was a slave, and he was owned by Philemon, when Philemon, as the paterfamilias, as the head of the household, becomes a Christian, everyone in his household would have followed suit. This is why Cornelius' household in Acts chapter 10, they all become Christians. The Philippian jailer in Acts chapter 16, when he decides to convert, his whole household is baptized. Well, why is that? Does it mean that they were dictated and that they didn't come to their own belief? No, it's because if the paterfamilias does something, the rest of the family does it, and that includes slaves. And so I have a hard time as a student of the Bible saying that Onesimus became a Christian after he ran away from Philemon, even when Philemon had already been a Christian for some time, so much so that the church was meeting in his house. Now, I can talk about Philemon for hours. I've presented academic papers on Philemon. I wrote a commentary on Philemon. I get going with Philemon. As a matter of fact, I'm kind of cheating because this class, I'm going to be out of town next week. So this class I'm using for my Wednesday night class next week, which is on Philemon. So I apologize if I talk about Philemon a lot. The pater, who is the oldest living man, was the head of the family. And so when Paul refers to the head of the household, husbands as the head of the household, he's not necessarily referring there to a man married to a woman. He's referring to the oldest living man in the household. Again, the bridge kind of tends to be longer and wider than we want to think sometimes. I think we can make that interpretation today because usually within our households, we don't live under that structure. In their world, in a more Eastern Oriental setting, the families would be multiple families under one roof. It's just much the same as it is today in Oriental cultures. So the oldest living man might be your great-great-grandfather. And that's to whom you go for your guidance as the head of the household. Today, in our Western world, I am the oldest living man in my household, and so I fulfill that role. The father had more obligations than just being a disciplinarian or raising his children. He was the religious official for the family, he was the financial authority, and he had absolute control over the lives of his wives and children. Usually the father dictated who his daughters married with arranged marriages. Most of the time he dictated what his sons did for a living, whether or not they took over the family business or learned a new trade or went on into government or whatever. Usually that's what happened. And so I mentioned earlier that I have a pet peeve with this word family. So the word that I like to use is the term household. I think in English that kind of encompasses more than just blood relatives, which their world would have as well. So how do you engage in this? Well, marriage is the first step, is it not? Marriages were usually arranged by the father. Now, when we're looking here at the Roman family, as we said on the first slide, I really should have edited that to say Greco-Roman family, which would also extend to the Palestinian, Judean region where Jesus would have grown up, what we read about in the Gospels, because they are controlled by the Roman government, and they fall into those, even though it's more of a Jewish Semitic worldview, they fall into the customs of the Roman world as well. So here on this next point, we'll talk about Mary a little bit. Most girls were married at the age of 14, though some were married at the age of 12. This is because the Romans believed that the younger the girl, the more apt she would be to bear children and live. We, of course, now know that's stupid. But they did not know that, and they thought, well, the younger you are, the more vigorous you are, and the more hardy you are, and so that would be a big help. And so, apologize for my misspelling. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is most likely around the age of 14 or 15 when she marries Joseph, when she's betrothed to Joseph. Two ways that we can know this, well, three ways. Number one, the general world would have married off their young ladies at around that age. Number two is the use of the descriptive term that Matthew uses from the Septuagint in Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14. Now, as Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, in Greek, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. You remember this from previous classes. In Greek, the word Parthenos is used. Isaiah 7:14 says, "Behold, a virgin shall bear a son, and you will call his name Emmanuel." Right? In Greek, the word Parthenos is used for virgin. Parthenos in Greek means virgin. In Hebrew, that word is not used. In Hebrew, the word is alma, which means young maiden or young woman. Now, why does Matthew translate it as Parthenos in Greek? Well, because his Greek version that he's using translated it that way. There's nothing wrong with that. We know from other passages that Mary had not known a man, and that she was miraculously conceived Jesus. And so I'm not denying the virgin birth by saying this. What I am saying is those are two ways we can tell a little bit about her age, because a Parthenos would have been, a virgin would have been someone who had not married. When you marry, you lose your virginity. That's the way their world works, and our world does as well. And then Matthew 7:14 in Hebrew, using alma to mean young maiden. Well, that's a young girl who's not been married yet either. So you get in both Greek and Hebrew, using the prophecy there to refer to Mary. When a young woman would be engaged, there would be a marriage contract that was written up and given to the father of the bride, and a ring would be presented to the bride. So we kind of do this today. Of course, you present the ring, right? And from what I have read, this may or may not be true. Some places I read that it is true, and others that it's not. I have read that the ring would be placed on the third finger of the left hand, and I think that part is true. Why that's true, I think, differs. And maybe you've heard this, that the Greeks believed that that was the only place where a vein runs directly to the heart. Now, the problem with that is the Greeks and the Romans did not believe that the heart was the seat of the emotions. They believed the bowels were, right? The guts. Splachnos in Greek. What a wonderful word to describe the guts. But so maybe not. Marriage was a semi-religious affair. It wasn't necessarily intended for religious purposes. We've made that religious today. You know, when I do weddings, I make it religious. I've done weddings for people who were atheists, and you better believe I make it religious. Okay, so we do that today because marriage is a divine gift from God in Genesis 2:24. But in Greco-Roman marriage, the gods would be consulted for a favorable date, but the gods were not the focus of the wedding. So you would consult the gods, when should I get married? They would give you a time. It's almost like, if you're familiar with the book of Esther, Haman cast lots to see when should be the day that he goes into Ahasuerus to ask him permission to kill the Jews. It's kind of like that. Right? Let's see. The bride would be dressed in a white tunic with a red veil and a headdress of flowers, very similar to what we do today. A reception would be hosted by the bride's father and would take place after the ceremony. Again, very similar to what we do today. Now, that's the Roman marriage. When you look at the first century Jewish marriage, a little bit different. There's not a reception after the wedding. There's a party for an extended number of days. So when let's see. John chapter 2, the wedding at Cana, right? It could be that the wedding was a couple of days ago, and now Jesus and his mother are able to go and celebrate. You know, they're still partying. Marriages were a big party in Semitic culture. One more thing about this, and I want to go back to our discussion of Mary and her age. This is one reason why scholars believe that Joseph is not present in the Gospels outside of the birth of Jesus. Because if Joseph is approximately 30, maybe even 40 years old, maybe older, probably around 30, 35, somewhere in there, he's probably dead by the time Jesus starts his ministry, much less the time he dies. This is very interesting because in one account, and I wish I would have done the research and could tell you which account, but in one account, the people are ridiculing Jesus and they say, "Is this not the son of Joseph?" And then in another account, another gospel of the exact same instance, they say, "Is this not the son of Mary?" Now, in this world, your father's lineage is what matters, is it not? And so when they say, "Is this not the son of Mary?" they're basically saying, "Is this not the guy who has no dad?" And I don't think necessarily that they're talking there about Joseph being dead. I think they're talking about Mary's miraculous conception. This word probably got around. I think about Christian persecution, especially in the world that we live in now, and just think about the type of persecution that Mary underwent as a pregnant, unmarried woman, so much so that she begins to show. And what kind of a man Joseph would have been. You know, Joseph has no recorded words in the entire Bible. We don't get anything that he ever said. We just get a picture of his character. Well, with marriage comes the threat of divorce and remarriage. And this is talked about in Matthew 19 and elsewhere, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and other places. But divorce in the Roman world could be instigated by any party. In the Jewish world, it could only be instigated by the man, right? But in the Roman world, any party, male or female, could instigate marriage. According to ancient historians, divorce was completely unknown until, in Rome at least, until the 3rd century BC. So 300 years before Jesus comes on the scene, there is no divorce. But then divorce gets introduced, and once divorce gets introduced and is made acceptable, divorce becomes rampant in their world. Now, you divorce your wife or your husband for literally anything. Makes you think of a world we know very well today, doesn't it? I mean, I remember when I started at Freed Hardeman, we would have classes about the Gospels and the teachings of things like divorce and remarriage. And it was always the joke, well, can you divorce your wife because she burnt the toast? For some reason, that phrase is what we always use, because she burnt the toast. And I always thought, well, this is an exaggerative way to talk about divorcing your wife for any reason. Well, in fact, at the time of Jesus, there are 2 schools of rabbinical thought. One is by a guy named Rabbi Hillel, and the other one is by a guy named Rabbi Shammai. I'm skipping a few points here, but just go with me. Rabbi Hillel said you could divorce your wife for any reason, especially if she burns supper. Those are his words, his writings. Rabbi Shammai, on the other hand, said you can only divorce your wife for marital unfaithfulness, if she cheats on you or whatever. And women could not divorce their husbands. We'll come back to that. So divorce becomes rampant. Because divorce is so popular, men are constantly marrying women who have been divorced before, right? And so you get the issue of marriage and divorce and remarriage in passages like Matthew 19. And I think for us as teachers and preachers of the Word, it's not so much that we are trying to get at the heart of can I or can't I get a divorce. And, there are books and sermon series and all kinds of things on divorce and remarriage. I tend to side with the Lord in that divorce is something that the Lord hates. God does not use the word hate in reference to a lot of things, but divorce is one of them. As such, The point of Matthew 19, as we're trying to teach it and preach it in our world, and to our congregation, in our classes, is not, can I get a divorce and still be all right in the eyes of God? It is, make sure you know who you are marrying so that divorce will not even be possible. And I understand there are certain reasons why divorce is there. And I do have to admit, I am thankful that the Lord does allow certain instances where divorce is permissible. And I have a lot of people, again, I don't do marriage counseling, I'm not qualified, but there are some things there in Matthew 19 and elsewhere where Jesus talks about divorce and remarriage, where we try to split the hairs on what we can and cannot do when we miss the total point of don't get divorced. You know, Jesus says, what God has joined together, let not man separate. And so we don't need to put ourselves in that separating mode. Now, going back to the context of their world, when we are thinking about passages like Matthew 19, we need to remember that Jesus is fighting the religious codes of his day, this oral law. You remember we talked about the Pharisees and how they had this allegiance to the oral law, right? This is what he's fighting, these two rabbis, Hillel and Shammai. And so what Jesus says there is not only him saying, I'm not siding with either of them, I'm siding with the Lord who said, what I've joined together, you're not to separate. But Jesus is making a cultural challenge to both Jews and Gentiles. And so I think about Paul, who is a Jewish man, but who grew up in a Gentile world. Right? In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul gives the expression, if you are tempted with sexual burnings and sexual desires and things like that, then go ahead and get married. Go ahead and get married. But I prefer that you stay single. Now, that's not Paul saying that marriage is wrong or that marriage is bad. Paul is simply doing, I think, what Jesus is doing here and saying that there is a cultural, earth-shattering thing that happens in the life of the believer when you become a Christian. That your obligation is not to yourself and not to your own desires, but to the Lord. So, again, divorce and remarriage, absolutely rampant in this world, and still is today. It's a huge problem for us today. The father of the family was obviously the head of the family. I find it interesting the pictures that the Spirit uses in Scripture, through inspired Scripture, to refer to the church. We talk about the church as the body, right? As the bride of Christ. One thing that we don't really talk about in the church a lot is that we are a family. We sing about it a lot. We are the family of God and all of that, but we don't really talk about that. As the family, we call each other brothers and sisters, and we have a heavenly Father, and all of that. So the same structure kind of takes place here. The father's the head of the family. He is the principal authority and religious authority. The father serves, if you will, as the high priest of the family. In a Roman society where you have your gods of your house, you've got shrines in your closet to all these different gods, it's the father's responsibility to keep putting food on the shrines and make sure the flowers are there and all pretty and everything. You will have a cemetery probably in your backyard of your family members. It's his job to keep that cemetery up to date and clean. That way the gods are pleased with that. So he has a lot of jobs as the head of the household. So when the father obeys, and we've already talked about this, so I'll hit this very briefly. When the father obeys the gospel, the rest of the household obeys. Why is that? Well, it's because the father is the principal religious figure in the family. And so if the father leads his family to faith, then they're going to follow suit. This does not mean that the family did not come to their own faith. I certainly believe they did, but I think they did because they believed and trusted in the leadership of the Father. The same can be said for us today. Why do we baptize children who are 12 and 13 years old? I'm not saying we shouldn't, but why do we? It's probably because they grew up in a household that was faithful to the Lord. And they saw their parents go to church, and they saw their parents have Bible study, and they trust that that what their father and mother, for that matter, is teaching them is true. So I think the same could be said today in a roundabout way. We talk about the father having ultimate authority here, and that is true in some sense, but the wife also does have a sense of autonomy. In Rome, women could be citizens, they could own land, but they did not have the same rights that men had. This is not true in Greece. In Greece, women were not considered citizens, nor were children or slaves, of course. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which we've referenced several times now, Paul says to women that they have just as much authority over the bodies of their husbands as a husband has over the authority of his wife. Now, usually we talk about husbands having authority over their wives because of what Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5, along around verse 22 and following there. I know he starts with wives, but then he says, verse 22 starts with wives. Wives, submit to your husbands, right? And boy, don't men love the word submit, right? So wives, submit to your husbands. And that's an authoritative term because it shows someone below you, at least in our way of thinking. I do not think at all that's what Paul's saying in Ephesians chapter 5. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he takes that a step further and says, okay, women, wives, you have just as much control over your husband as he has over you. That is earth-shattering news. And that's really what Paul does in his theology. Paul will take cultural norms and just break them, which is what Christians are supposed to do. I mean, look at our world today. If Christians really were being like Paul, as we often talk about wanting to do, or being like Jesus, we would be turning this world on its head. And I know some Christians are very good at doing that in more of a angry way. That's not at all what I'm suggesting, but we are to be the light of the world, and light can't be hidden. The mother is the oldest living female in the family, of course. Slaves are prominent in the first century household. That's a fact. As a matter of fact, slaves are just as common then as driving a car is today. We'll talk a little bit about that illustration in a few minutes. Now, whereas we might say, okay, well, if they're slaves, then that means that they're taking care of everything, right? I mean, think about the last movie you saw that had American slave history in it. It was the slaves who cooked. It was the slaves who cleaned. It was the slaves who took care of the children. It was the slaves who worked in the fields. Slaves did everything, and the masters did nothing except make money, right? That's not true in the ancient world. Those slaves were prominent in first century households. The mother was responsible for the household needs like cooking and raising children. When you come to Titus chapter 2 and verse 5, Paul tells the women there that they should be teaching the younger women to do what?
Obey their husbands.
To obey their husbands. What else?
And that the word of God may not be blasphemed.
Right. Now, it may not be in verse 5, but there's somewhere in that context it talks about being a homemaker and obeying your husband, as you mentioned. Very good. So, this is a difficult passage for us to teach to our teenage girls, right? Because American culture, and there's nothing wrong with this, but American culture has said, if you want to do something, if you want to be something, you go do it, you go be it. No one's holding you back except yourself. You have the freedoms and liberty to do that. And I agree with that 1,000%. However, I do think that there is godliness in learning to be a Christian wife and mother. And so I get asked a lot because in the Church of Christ, of course, at least the conservative Church of Christ, we get a very bad rap for women's roles and letting or not letting women do certain things. And one of the questions, as we talked about earlier with the kids' question and answers that I do, one of the questions was, what can I do as a girl to serve the church? I thought it was a great question. And I pointed this person to this passage. And one of the best things you can do is be the best and most loving wife and mother. And that is not at all degrading. I do not believe that men are superior to women. And I don't even believe that the roles in the church are necessarily there to elevate men and suppress women, as most people would looking at the church from the outside in. But there are certain responsibilities that God has given to men, and there are certain responsibilities that God has given to women. I, according to Scripture, should not be the one to teach a young woman how to be a loving mother and wife. That's not my job as a man. It is the role of older women in the church to do that. And we need older women to take these younger women under their wings. We need that. And it's largely lacking because we, unfortunately, have let our young ladies believe that all they're good for is filling a pew and singing the soprano on songs. I'm off my rant. So the mother's responsibility, household needs, raising children, things like that, but she also was the manager of the slaves. Now, we might think the father would be the manager of the slaves. No, not really, because he's going to be the manager of his business and the agriculture, his farm or whatever. The wife is going to manage the slaves. In Proverbs chapter 31, now I understand that this is going back to the Old Testament, but it makes a good point here that in Proverbs chapter 31, all the success of the husband in that passage on the model woman, or the magnificent woman, or whatever you want to call it, all the credit for her husband's success is due to her. So you hear behind every good man is a good woman. That is the theme of Proverbs 31. The man is the head of the household, but the woman is the neck. Again, I think there's a lot of truth in that. Notice in Proverbs 31, I don't remember what verse it is, but it says, her husband is an elder in the gates of the city. The gates of the city was where they held court in the ancient world. And so he's a legislator in the city. But it doesn't, even though the point and the focus is on him and his role, it says her husband. It doesn't say the husband. It says her husband. It attributes his success to her. And that's made much more evident in the Hebrew text than it is in English. But nevertheless, it's there. In Proverbs 31, the model woman is also managing the slaves. She is over the vineyard, as it were. She takes some money and she buys a vineyard. And she begins making money, and she knows how to work with her hands. She's skillful. A Roman man could divorce or kill his wife if she was caught in adultery or tasted wine on her lips. Now, we might think of the very famous passage in John 7:53 through 8:11, the pericope de adultera, the woman caught in adultery, and that she's brought to Jesus, and they say, well, what do you make of this? And there's about 1.5 million problems with that particular passage, none of which I will go into tonight. But the interesting thing about that passage is if we are reading it in a Jewish context, which we should because these are Jewish people who are bringing her to Jesus, the law of Moses states that she's to be stoned, and the man she was with is also to be stoned, which does not happen according to the story. In the Roman side of things, if this were to happen, then she could be killed or divorced. Now, you may be wondering, what happens if the man is caught in adultery? Not a stinking thing. So, the Roman wife/mother was always expected to live with the utmost propriety. She was to be the model woman in every single sense. A man could be a dog, the woman had to be the model, right? Childbirth was incredibly dangerous and still is today, but in that world where you don't have any help or anything like that, just incredibly dangerous. And because of the danger, many women would die very early. And of course, this adds to the complexity of marrying a woman off at 12 or 14. I mean, of course she's going to have complications. I find it so interesting that Mary, of course, has Jesus first. He's the firstborn son of her, but she has other children, right? And so I think God was very good and gracious to Mary in allowing her childbirth and things like that. Of course, you don't know what the complications were, or if there were, or whatever. In the Roman world, this is not true for the Jews, but in the Roman world, when a child was born, if it was female, the child would probably be rejected. If it was male, the child would be laid at the father's feet. And the father could either pick up the child or not pick up the child. But if the father picks up the child, then the child becomes his. He claims it. If the child is not picked up, then the father rejects the child. And so you think, well, what if a child was born with a deformity? What if the child was brown-headed instead of blonde-headed? I mean, literally any reason the father could reject the child. And so what happens with that child? If he does not pick the child up, the child is exposed. That's the term that's used in referring to these children. I hate talking about this. It makes me emotional. The child would be taken to the woods outside of the town, left for dead. The good news is, if there is good news in this scenario, that child would most often be picked up by slave traders. And you say, well, that's not good news. Well, at least the child doesn't die. But if the child is picked up by slave traders, it will be raised to be a slave and be sold into slavery, and will serve out that lifestyle as such. Other children would be taken and raised for gladiatorial sport. They would learn how to be gladiators from a very early age, probably around the age of 4 or 5. They would start their training, which ultimately you're training on how to die. So just horrible ways to live. Now, the exposing of children, I make it sound like it was a really common thing. On the one hand, it was common because it occurred, but on the other hand, most fathers were willing to accept their children, especially if they were male children, because every father wanted their lineage to pass on through their male child. So much so that if you never have a male child, you can adopt and have that male child, which we talked about, I think, with like Caesar Augustus was adopted by Julius Caesar, and then more and more of the emperors were adopted as well. For children, there was no such thing as adolescence in the ancient world. You either were a child or you were an adult. And adulthood started much earlier for them than it does for us today. Even today, it's interesting to make observations of the world. Don't you think that people, perhaps my age or Kyle's age, are still children in the way that they act sometimes? I have friends who I hope don't watch this video. They spend, I kid you not, 90% of their times in front of a TV screen with a controller in their hand. And I'm sitting there thinking, you child, like, grow up. I mean, I'm not asking you to give that up completely if it's something that you enjoy doing and it's recreational, but my goodness, get up and get a job. You know, just, my goodness. Well, in the ancient world, around the age of 7 for boys is when they start their training on how to become a man. And I think because our world has talked about toxic masculinity, we've kind of softened on manliness in this world. We need godly men just the same as we need godly women. But we need godly men. One of the best sermons I've ever heard was on the deathbed of David in, 2 Samuel 1, I guess, something like that. When David dies, Solomon is at his bedside, and he tells him, show yourself a man. In other words, we want to be colloquial in English, be a man. And he tells him how? Meditate on the law of the Lord. What does it mean to be a man? It means to be like God. And we need that. Well, in their world, the training to become a man started very early. So boys would go to school around age 7. The girls would stay at home to learn homemaking. Of course, we've already referenced Titus 2, 3 through 5. But girls could also go to school if their families were wealthy enough. So if you could afford to send your child to school, then you could go for it. And it wasn't that girls weren't allowed the opportunity to go. It's just in that world, girls had their job and guys had their job, and so boys would go around the age of 7. Boys would finish secondary school, what we might call high school, around the age of 16. And within that 7 to, I'll call it 18 years old range, there are 3 levels of education. Now, depending on who you read and who you talk to, these are called different things. Basically the same thing. The first is your primary education, which is called grammatistes, where you would learn reading and writing and memorization. Now, memorization is a big key because remember, there's no printing press. You don't have books, and if you did have a book, a copy of that book was very expensive. And so how do you learn? So let me go back. At this level, they're learning one thing and one thing only, and that is the writings of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. By the time they finish school, they will be able to quote the Iliad and the Odyssey all the way through verbatim. Now that's impressive, right? When you graduate on to secondary education, which is called the grammatikos, you are learning grammar, dialect, math, and astronomy. Now, astronomy is important for what reason? Anybody want to take a guess? It doesn't have to do with anything mystical or like reading the signs or anything like that. What was the map in the ancient world? Stars, right? And so at this point, most of the boys are learning how to be military leaders. They're learning how to be colonels and generals and whatever other captains and whatnot, centurions and leaders. To do that, you have to know where you are at all points on this earth. And so they learn astronomy to learn how to travel, to learn the map, right? And then finally, most of them would stop at secondary education. But the select few who would go on to what we might call graduate work, postgraduate work, whatever in today's world, would learn what's called rhetor. This is where we get our term rhetoric. They would study law and philosophy. These are people who would serve in the military for about a couple of years, and then they would go on to be the governors and the princes and the consuls and things like that. We talked about death in the ancient world already on past classes, so I'm going to skip over this and spend the rest of our time talking about slavery. Again, I wrote a commentary on Philemon. I've presented papers at universities on Philemon. I could talk about this all day long. As a matter of fact, now one of the classes that I'm co-teaching this semester for Faulkner, one of their assignments is to talk about slavery in the first century, because we're trying to teach them how to read their Bible as we're learning how to do it now, where you read it in their world and then transfer it into your world in the process of that. And it amazes me how many of them, when they talk about slavery, automatically talk about slavery from an American perspective. Even when the assignment says, tell me the historical context of slavery in the first century, they immediately go to slavery in the American world. So if you take nothing else from the class, take this. Slavery in the first century was drastically different, but somewhat similar to slavery in American culture. Okay? Well, slavery in the ancient world was an accepted part of culture. The common illustration we've talked about already is to say that slavery for them is like driving cars for us. Now look, I drive a big truck. I love my truck. My truck gets horrible fuel mileage, and I use fossil fuels like they're going out of style. Okay? Now whether you side on whatever side of global warming and whatnot, we can all agree that the invention of cars has harmed the created world somehow. Okay? Now, I don't fall into the global warming thing or whatever, but obviously things are going to happen, right? But we drive them. Let's ignore the fossil fuel thing. Every time I get in my car, I run the risk of dying. Someone could hit me. I could flip. I have flipped trucks before. You know, things could happen. But I still do it. All right? Even though I know the dangers and even though I know some things that are bad about it, I still do it. That's kind of the way slavery was in the first century. Even though it's not the ideal. And even though the Bible never actually condemns slavery, It is a part of the society, and it was actually a very needed and necessary part of the society. Rome would have never been what Rome became had it not been for slaves. Slaves built Rome, every bit of it. Okay? Now, the way slavery differs is that slavery was not racially motivated. So, in Rome, your next door neighbor may be a slave and you never know it because they look and dress and talk like you. They just might have sold themselves into slavery because they owed a debt. Maybe they were captured in war or whatever. I mean, it was never an issue of race or nationality as it has become in American culture. Roman law does separate the difference between human property, that of slaves, and object property, like having a cow or your chariot or cart or your home or whatever. So it does do that. But that line is so vague and blurred at times. So when we read the ancient writers and the ancient historians about slavery, some of them will talk about the humanity of the slave, and others will say that the slaves had no soul. Okay? So it's very blurred. Slaves ultimately have no rights, and they have no nationality. So if you are fighting a war in Germania, let's say the Romans are fighting a war in Germania, you capture the Germanian soldiers, they become slaves, they are stripped of their nationality. They don't get to celebrate anything of their nation. They don't get to... Let's say that China comes over and takes us over and we're all slaves of China. Okay? We don't get to celebrate the 4th of July anymore. We lose our nationality, right? We also lose our familial heritage. And so a slave has no father or mother in the eyes of their owner. Why is that? Because you're the master. You're the ultimate authority. Okay? As such, slaves, as we mentioned, were considered part of the Greco-Roman Familia, of the household. Now, this is so very important for our understanding of Paul's letter to Philemon. Philemon is a one-chapter letter. It's 25 verses long. It's the stereotypical length of a letter in the first century. But Paul writes there. It's interesting. We have to be kind of like Indiana Jones with Philemon because we have the final product. We have to reconstruct the narrative that led to the final product. So there are a plethora of views on what that history, what that context looked like. Here's the typical one. Here's the traditional one. Philemon is a slave owner. Philemon is married to Apphia, and they have a son named Archippus, who is the preacher for the Colossian congregation. Philemon is probably an elder in Colossae. He is a slave owner. He owns a slave named Onesimus. Onesimus runs away for whatever reason, we're not told, but he runs away probably from Colossae to Ephesus, where Paul is most likely in prison. Some people would say Paul's in prison in Rome. I don't think so, because Onesimus has to run away and evade slave traders. Ephesus is about 3 days away from Colossae. Pretty close. It's the next biggest town. Okay? So he runs away somehow, I don't know how, somehow meets up with Paul, and Paul sends him back. As a runaway slave, Philemon has every legal right to crucify Onesimus. I said crucify, which is the way Jesus died. You know, the pain and agony and torment we talk about with Jesus. Jesus was not the only one to be crucified. Far from it. It was the most common form of execution in the ancient world. So Onesimus was threatened with that. He returns letter in hand. And I imagine Onesimus walking up to the door of Philemon's house and knocking on the door, Philemon answering the door, being mad as a hornet, and Onesimus sticking the letter out. And then Philemon reads the letter. As Philemon reads the letter, he sees verse 2, and he says that the letter is not only addressed to him, but it's addressed to the entire church. Verse 2 says, the church that is in your house. And so as Philemon reads that, he says, well, I need to read this to the church. And so he reads it to the church. And other people see that this letter shows them how, as slave owners, they are to treat their slaves who are Christians. And so the letter gets copied and circulated. And why do I think that? Because we have it in our Bible. How would we have it if it wasn't copied and circulated? If it was just thrown in the trash, we wouldn't have it. All of that to say, when Onesimus comes back, well, actually, let's back up. When Onesimus leaves, when he runs away, he breaks the familial tie with the household. When he comes back, Paul says in verse 16, receive him back not as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. And so Paul there uses that familial term that we so often use in the church to refer to the relationship. I don't think that's an accident. I think that's something we need to pay very special attention to. One thing that I do have a pet peeve with, and I'll end with this, is when we preach on passages like Ephesians 6 and Colossians 4 and Philemon, and we talk about slave and master relationship. Masters treat your slaves as you would want to be treated by the Lord and by other people. You know what I'm talking about. We liken that to a boss and employee relationship. I don't think you can do that. It's two different worlds. Now, you might take the theme of submission and authority and translate that into how we as employers or employees have that relationship and treatment and whatnot. But the slave and master relationship is within the family of faith already. And so I don't think it should be necessarily taught or preached about our relationship with our employer as much as it should be our relationship with those within the family of God. That we need to treat them the way we would want to be treated and to submit to them and things like that. So, we'll end with this. Why does it all matter? Number one, Jesus, of course, teaches on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, Matthew 19 and elsewhere. And if we don't have a grasp on what marriage, divorce, and remarriage look like in that world, we're probably going to take that passage out of context. Number two, Paul taught on the family. We've already referenced Ephesians 5 and 6, Philemon, what else? Colossians 4, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus all have something to do with the household. I mean, Paul really does talk a lot about the household and the family here. And I would argue that all of us, whether we're fathers, mothers, children, whatever, we often talk about going to the Bible to see who we need to be and to live our spiritual lives. It starts in the household. It really does. It starts in the family. And lastly, the issue of slavery, of course, remains a prominent topic today, with those on both sides of the issue citing the Bible. One interesting thing, if you ever want to do research on the Civil War and the proponents for and against slavery, is to see how they used Paul's letter to Philemon. Those who were against slavery said that Paul says, we're receiving back as a brother, and that means he was freed, even though the text never says that. And then those for slavery say, well, Onesimus was a slave, and Paul allowed slaves, and Paul talks about slaves and masters. And the same thing is done today. I think the theological theme is this: treat everyone with respect and dignity and love that God treats us with.